Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guests today are Dr. Deborah Pomeroy and F. Joseph Merlino. Deborah is an associate professor emeritus of science education at Arcadia University, and much of her work in higher education involves both helping facilitate the development of new curricula and facilitating and studying the impact of partnerships between professors and high school teachers. F. Joseph Merlino is the president of the 21st Century Partnership for STEM Education, co-author of a new book, New Era, New Urgency, The Case for Repurposing Education. For 35 years, he served as principal investigator or director for many National Science Foundation, U.S. Department of Education, and USAID development projects, including co-PI on a 6-year project to study transformative STEM change in 6 higher education institutions. Deborah and Joseph worked together in Egypt, where they have redesigned a new integrated STEM education curricula funded by USAID that includes STEM teacher preparation programs. And they join us today to talk about the lessons they've learned on how to affect organization change through adherence and addressing the 5 quandaries of higher ed president. Deb, Joe, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm looking forward to our conversation. You guys are just amazing with some of the work that you've done, especially in the research for higher ed and high school business models. Before we get into that stuff, I want to hear a little bit about your background. So if one of you wouldn't mind starting off.
Sure. I started off as a bench and field scientist for several years, and then I went into science teaching in Alaska for about 19 years. During that time, I got the Presidential Award in Excellence in Science Teaching, which sort of carried me into a very thoughtful stage of my practice, and I then moved into science teacher education. During that time, I did some consulting in teaching and learning and curriculum, especially integrated curriculum development. And that sort of led me into working on some grants, especially where I started to met Joe, and we started to work together in a nonprofit that we founded. We were working with professors and high school teachers in transforming their pedagogy. And all of this culminated in an amazing project in Egypt, where we worked to help the Ministry of Education there develop 21 model STEM schools with an integrated curriculum that ultimately required a major transformation in teacher education. And so I'm going to let Joe continue the story because it's a good one.
Well, I started off at the University of Rochester, where I started off as a chemical engineer and wound up tasting the subjects of politics and economics and psychology, and wound up going into education where I was a math teacher, and then got a job at a nonprofit doing education reform in Philadelphia. And for the last 35 years, I've been doing education reform at the secondary level and also in higher education. And I'm currently president of the 21st Century Partnership for STEM Education for about 17 years. Our prize project is in Egypt. We're working with 5 universities transforming their teacher preparation program, involving 180 new courses that we developed with about 60 U.S. faculty and in 5 different programs. And they're all doing the same courses in the same program. But along the road, we also studied U.S. universities, and that became a springboard for our ability to work in Egypt through the study of higher education in the U.S.
That's for the listeners who may be thinking, wait a minute, how is this going to apply to higher ed? Hang on, we are going to get there very quickly, because they have made a couple of statements here that are really amazing, changing teacher preparation in higher ed. These lessons are going to apply to how we structure our colleges and our universities today. So we all know the challenges, and thank you for sharing those backgrounds. We all know the challenges in higher ed right now. There's a demographic cliff that's coming up, a reduction of the traditional students. The public perception is not good. The president's role is becoming increasingly complex, and it's clearly reflected in president's tenure, whereas 15 years ago it was over 10 years, and now it's down to 5 and dropping even more. You're even seeing articles in the Chronicle coming out saying, why would anybody want to be a university president? Sometimes on bad days, I would have to agree with them on that. But you did a paper on the quandaries that higher ed presidents are dealing with. So let's talk a little bit about that. It's understanding who the constituencies are and understanding what they've got to figure out. And from that, we'll be able to put it together to be able to show what you've done with, for instance, the University of Texas at El Paso and how this work has really impacted them. So if you would, please start us off.
Yeah. So you mind, Deborah?
This is your part.
Okay. So the National Science Foundation awarded presidents and provosts a couple $1 million each, about 30 institutions, to integrate their NSF programs to lead the innovation. And we got selected to research about 6 of these universities that were undergoing changes. And we did site visits and a variety of document reviews and interviews with presidents and the provosts and deans and some faculties, kind of a 360 review in these institutions. And out of that came, we were trying to make sense of how each institution went about addressing their challenges. And there were common challenges across all of them, but there were also differences. So we came up with 4 what we call quandaries. These are common dilemmas, you might say, that these institutions were dealing with.
Okay. So what were those quandaries, and do we need to go in because every president and the boards are dealing with different state groups of stakeholders, as you call them, constituencies?
Yes.
You tell me, does it make sense to go through the quandaries or the constituencies?
Well, so you've got constituencies. Of course, you have your parents and your students. You also have your business and employers and your donors, and then you have the government regulators, whether it be at the state or at the federal level, that have to do that. So the president has got to be mindful of those constituencies and demands, which are not necessarily all in the same direction and kind.
Really?
Right. I'm sorry.
You mean they pull in different directions? Yeah. I never would have figured that.
But each institution has a legacy to it, a reason why it existed in the beginning, and a history to it, and it's situated in a context. But all of them deal with, in one way or another, what we call 4 quandaries. So the first quandary is mission versus revenue. What I mean by that is you have a disconnect between why students go to universities. According to the research, it's to get a better job, for the most part. But you also have against that is the historic mission of a university, which is more than preparing people to get a job. Otherwise, they'd be a for-profit institution or a technical place. But their role historically has been a social and personal one, in the sense that you want to, the liberal tradition of expanding people's horizons, making them a better person, having them be able to understand other people and other cultures. It's a broader mission than just a professional education.
It sounds to me like it's a conflict between job readiness versus public good. Yeah. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I always say public and personal good. People don't like to be transformed until they are, because then you say, oh, this was a tremendous experience, and which is why, right, people contribute back to the university because it had a profound effect on their lives, right? So, if you're just going to a training school, okay, it was a contractual, transactional relationship. I paid my money, I got something from it, but I don't owe you anything more. But the whole idea is that the university is transformative. It should be. And that's why donors contribute back to it. But that's the conflict, is how do you get that?
So mission versus revenue.
Mission versus revenue. The second one has to do with, I'll say, hierarchies versus hierarchies. Yeah, so universities are organized by disciplines, right? You've got your schools and then you've got your departments, and then within the departments you have subspecialties, and your tenure and promotion practices are all based upon your peers in your discipline, and your journal publications are, reviewed by that, and your grant applications are all disciplinary focused. But at the same time, against that are that if you want to solve problems or innovate, it requires interdisciplinary collaboration, that no one discipline can solve solar energy or the climate crisis. And it requires collaboration, not only cross interdisciplinary, but also collaboration. But the structures of universities, it's a challenge for the structure of universities to create those kinds of conditions that allows that to happen. Some universities have established research institutes. Others have established buildings of interdisciplinary connections. But by and large, it's fighting the gravitational pull of the disciplines. And of course, students don't experience, or it's not often that they experience, the kind of transdisciplinary experiences that we've been able to do in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A great example, I think, of this is a guest that I had on one of my earlier podcasts, Judith Kellstrom, who is the director emerita of the UC Davis Biotech program. And you've got such a complex discipline, you have to bring in specialists from other disciplines to be able to make it work. I think this is what you're talking about, is it not?
If I could just jump in real quick, I think it's really important that we go beyond the way we normally talk about. We've often talked about disciplines as being in silos. And I think this is actually one step beyond that, because we're talking about, even within the silos, we're talking about vertical versus flat. And so it's not just that we're siloed, although I think that is a very real constraint, but it's about how we think about the structures themselves. And do we think about those in a hierarchical manner of having to go up or down the ladder of decision-making and communication and so forth? Or do we have the freedom, and are we encouraged and supported in going just flat across? Yeah. So I think we have to deepen the discussion beyond that silo discussion.
And it's not I don't see it as an either or. I see it as a both and.
Yes.
But how that plays out at the universities, for example, is your T&P policies. So do you just have your own disciplinary people judge whether or not you should be promoted? Or do you get any rewards for collaborative efforts? NSF, NIH, a lot of other funders are looking for these kind of innovative solution that requires these cross collaborations.
Oh, well, absolutely. And I had the director of NSF on the program a few months ago, and Ponch said that specifically. They are looking for cross-discipline research grants, right, giving those rather than just in the particular silo. We're also seeing colleges restructuring and building, like what a friend of mine went to years ago at University of Alabama, and I'm talking about many years ago, a very dear friend of mine, New College, which brought in interdisciplinary studies.
Yeah.
I think nowadays what you're talking about is even more critical, given the complexity of the world and the complexity of the solutions that need to be made.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, one of the founders of our board was a former deputy director of the National Science Foundation. His name was Joe Berdonia, who preached integration for innovation a lot. But the other thing I would say is that integration and interdisciplinary work is best done, and Deborah can talk about this more, when there's a purpose to it, when there's a goal in mind that provides the impetus for why you should be doing interdisciplinary work.
Deborah?
Yeah. So what we've discovered is that interdisciplinary work just for itself is certainly richer than work which is just done within any given discipline. There's no question about that, when we can draw from chemistry and biology and physics and mathematics and even the humanities, which we strongly believe in, to pull everything in around perhaps themes and so forth. Our work in Egypt, we were able to focus that work around a purpose, which was basically preparing students to solve the grand challenges of Egypt, which are challenges that we would all recognize, dealing with alternative energy and overpopulation and pollution and so forth and so on. So when the high school students and also the people who would become those high school students' teachers, when they started to focus their learning around what is it that I need? What are the concepts and skills and habits of mind that I need in order to be able to solve part of this problem, one of these very large, complex problems? All of a sudden, it takes on an entirely different meaning, the learning does. And something that's really interesting that we didn't mention earlier, and I really wanted to put in there, is that in university structures, I think historically, almost everybody would agree that education, the colleges and departments of education, are often overlooked in thinking about integration. And one of the things that has been fun in our work is that we've been able to change professors and deans and presidents' mindsets as to the value of education departments in collaborations across those disciplines. So that's something that I just would love to throw out there.
Let's make sure we come back to that,
Okay.
because for those of us who have gone through and gotten an advanced degree and got into the classroom, we're never taught how to teach.
Right. Exactly.
We're taught a technical discipline, but how do we teach? And it becomes the sins of the father, sins of the sons and daughters.
Exactly.
The way we learn. So let's go back to the quandaries, because I think you gave us a great example of the importance, the focus of purpose and mission. If you look at it from a change model, it's just like John Cotter's first thing. You have to establish an urgency.
Yeah.
What is the urgency? So, Joseph, if you would.
Sure. There's two others that we saw, and one has to do with college access, equity versus excellence, academic excellence. So as you mentioned earlier, the demographics. So if you look at the demographics in K-12, right now we're looking at a majority-minority population. It changed over in 2020. And you look at the academic achievement of those students in state tests. They break down as follows in math and in science and in English. Asians score higher. White students are the next. Black and Hispanic students next. But the big difference is around poverty. Economically disadvantaged versus not economically disadvantaged. That's the biggest difference. So you have the challenge of the academic preparedness of students coming into higher education. Not only their academic preparedness, but their means of paying for it. So even if there's federal grants that can make it free, you still have the question of academic preparedness. And as Kenneth Edelman analyzed college readiness, it's the academic intensity of high school that makes a difference whether or not you're going to be prepared and complete college. Because right now, as you know, the percentage of people that complete college in 4 years is not as high as it should be. And instead, it's 6 years metrics. But even that, you have about a quarter not making it. So the question is, do you lower your standards for admission? Now, I'm not talking about the very elite universities, national universities, which have a large pool to draw from. I'm talking about basically everyone else. How do you handle that, particularly if you're tuition driven? Do you lower your standards in order to attract more people? How do you deal with the relationship between your feeder high schools and the institution itself?
You guys have come up with some great solutions, and I'm going to ask the listeners to be patient on that, because I think your solutions around this one are just amazing. So the last one of your quandaries, I believe, is in-state versus out-of-state students.
Yeah, so we noticed, for example, one of our institutions we looked at was University of Colorado at Boulder, which is a state institution. And we spent some time there, and actually we're using them on the Egypt project, but about 45% of their students are out of state. And it's a good place. And Boulder's not a bad place to live in either.
No, it isn't.
So, but what you've got is a dilemma, because you get a quandary. You get a lot of more money from tuition if they're out of state than if you're in state. That's true all over. And that's particularly the case when you have the state giving less money to the universities, which has been dropping as a percentage. So there's an incentive to go where you can get double or triple. At the same time, though, University of Colorado Boulder is not a private institution. They have to report to the state, and that's state regulation. So satisfying the state's need for efficiency and for accountability from a state, and at the same time having to deal with less money from them, and you're out of state. So you don't get any props for having out of state students.
It's challenging too, because when you have in-state students, normally there's be a tuition discount for publics. Your tax dollars are going to help support the education, and there is at least an implicit expectation that the students will remain in the state and add to the state's GDP, their skills, whatnot, so it becomes an investment into these students.
Yes.
If you have to do it from a tuition perspective, you obviously want outside students. It's almost as though the states, I'm going to get myself in trouble on this statement. It's almost as if the states are failing the students and the institutions in there by not funding education to the degree that it should be.
And to that, I would add, they're also, if they leave the state, they're not benefiting the state. As you know, the land grant, the Merrill Act of 1862 attempted to have the land grants benefit the states. That was the whole idea. And of course, there's interactions between these quandaries.
Really? I mean, they're not silos like all higher eds are?
No. So what we would say is that every institution has a solution, a temporary solution to how to deal with these quandaries, which I call the policy amalgam. So if you are a reformer, you want to do something different at the institution, you have to consider, and what you don't, is how does a president, if they want to institute something different, how does that upset the apple cart of how these quandaries are dealt with?
Right.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is basically a new model for higher education, or at least parts of it.
Yeah, I think of these as like four continua. And you could sort of imagine a visual sense of like four strings that you hold in different directions. But each university finds itself somewhere on each of those four. And if you take the nexus of where all four of those would cross, then that gives you a sense of that point, that amalgam that Joe's talking about. And so anytime you have any kind of a change which is going to disrupt that balance, then you thoughtfully have to consider and understand and attend to how that is going to affect the position along those other continua. And so that's the model. It's a matter of attending to all of those different tensions.
I would look at it from a systems or a holistic perspective, or even a design thinking perspective of what are the outcomes that you're wanting to make sure you get. And then how do you need to change the levers within the model to be able to get those outcomes? I don't think people think like that. I think it's mostly, this is where we are, this is where we want to go, so what do we need to do, rather than starting with your goal in mind.
And that's what we did actually in Egypt, exactly that thing, Drumm. We had a goal, and then we had to figure out, what do we have to change? And as it turned out, it was almost everything.
But by studying first the universities and their quandaries, when we went to Egypt, we found that they have a different set of quandaries. But we were looking at the whole idea of a quandary as a way of trying to analyze how we should change the teacher preparation program in 5 very large institutions, each one of which is twice the size of an Arizona State University, for example, with a lot of, like their students don't pay tuition. It's all government funded. But they have a lot of so when we wrote the grant for the project, it's a $25 million project, we had these quandaries in mind. And so we started with the presidents in the Supreme Council of Universities. And we had certain conditions that we asked for in order to make these kinds of changes. And we did it systematically from a systems idea.
So the next piece of that, which is that sort of led into our theory of action. And that is that, first of all, attending to what's the goal. That's the first part. Then what are the quandaries within which the universities are situated and positioned? And then thinking about the fact that we do understand that change happens across networks, and both institutional networks, formal and informal. And then what became one of our major theories was a combination of top-down, middle-out, and bottom-up change. Understanding that no change that's worth anything in terms of sustainability is going to happen without all three of those working together in the same direction.
Yeah. And that makes perfect sense, especially when I look at it from our perspective, and what we do with strategic planning and change management is top-down approach, but then there's the bottom-up, the stakeholders, as well as getting their input on what's going on. But there's also the external piece with that as well. You have donors, you have government entities, towns, etc. How do you bring all those together to make sure that you can attend to the goal, as you say?
Yeah, so we found that it's very helpful to have an external facilitator, I would say, like an NSF. In the case of our Egypt, we had U.S. Agency for International Development, and that had a certain prestige to it that got everyone's attention, and we were a neutral broker, and it became a way of facilitating change. In the case of our study of the universities, it was NSF initiating change by giving the provost and the president $1.5 million. That's not a lot of money, but then again, departments don't have a lot of money, and you're always vying for a piece of the budget. But it was a stimulus to it. We also found that in the case of changing, we looked at 6 universities, the president and the provost had what I call a posse. These are people, an informal network of usually people from their same discipline. And each university had a different kind of posse. One was from the math department. Another was from the psychology department. Like the president was a psychologist, their provost came from that, etc. And that they're informal change agents at the middle level, at the mesio level, departmental level, were also from that same posse group. And then you had some faculty. So at each of these levels that we're talking about, you had like-minded people working at their respective levels. And so if you're an outside person coming in to do a change process at a university, you have to identify, as you say, these informal networks of leaders, in addition to the formal networks.
Yeah, Cotter would say you have to have a guiding coalition.
Yes.
And that coalition doesn't have to be all at the top. In fact, it shouldn't be. It should be at multiple levels, because you're going to end up having to sell this change. It's going to impact people's lives, their livelihoods, everything.
So building on your idea of having to convince people to change, it's really, really hard for somebody to tell somebody else you have to change, or to tell an institution.
Really? I never would have guessed that.
Yeah, right.
Just ask your spouse, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that gets into really talking about a theory of change. And clearly, individuals and institutions have to be convinced of the need to change, but that is not going to happen by an outside agent saying you have to change. That change has to come from a realization, a confrontation with evidence that conflicts with their prior conceptions, or that conflicts with their conceptions of what is working. For instance, if a professor thinks that lecturing all day long is working, the only way they're going to be convinced otherwise is to actually experience a confrontation where they've done a brilliant job of lecturing, but the students haven't learned a thing. And Hestenes and Haloun and Eric Mazur have all done terrific work on looking at the impact of confronting their misconceptions that lecturing in physics did not have an impact on the students' understanding of their misconceptions. So one of the things that we try to do, we have done in our work in Egypt especially, is have our high school kids who are doing work which is basically so far beyond a person's expectations of what high school students can do. And that's part of that is we just took the lid off the expectations for them. We just said, yeah, you can solve some of these grand challenges. And you know what? They've started to do that. And these kids have won all sorts of international awards and so forth. And when we have these kids present their projects to professors, and they present their projects to presidents and provosts and even chancellors of education, they all look at each other and say, my God, this is work, this quality of master's students. But these are high school kids, and so then they, it's not until they actually confronted the reality that there could be another way to learn, and that other way to learn would require just amazing transformations. Then it started.
Thanks for listening, and a special thank you to my guests, Deborah Pomeroy and F. Joseph Merlino, for their willingness to share their insights on organization change and how to better integrate higher education institutions for more student success. Tune in next week for the conclusion of our show. Until next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.